this didn't even start yesterday anymore. It's already basically, for several weeks now, we've been seeing that Ukraine's operation to force Russia to make peace is really working. As I called it, Zelensky, ironically referring to what Putin himself had repeatedly declared in the past. I think the main thing we need to understand about the current situation is that, as of today, Ukraine is not pursuing the goal of conducting an operation in Crimea or launching a large-scale counteroffensive. At the very least, no one knows anything about such plans. The main objective that Ukraine is pursuing right now is, first and foremost, to make the maintenance of Crimea and the upkeep of the southern occupying group of troops, which are occupying Crimea and the adjacent territories of mainland Ukraine, unbearably costly for Russia. Considering how personally attached Putin is to Crimea and how important Crimea is to him, from the perspective of his own PR and the way he positions this object, and how important it is from the standpoint of maintaining legitimacy, justifying everything that Putin has done in Russia. Of course, Putin, who absolutely doesn't care about the Crimean people themselves, or even about those occupiers he brought to Crimea since 2014, will still try with all his might to hold on to Crimea. Therefore, the more forces and resources are directed towards maintaining Crimea and the group of troops holding it, the harder it will be for Russia to fight on other fronts. Moreover, we see that today, Ukrainian forces have struck, including, for example, an oil refinery in the Krasnodar region, and the fuel crisis in southern Russia, which also depends without exception on Crimea, will continue to grow. Therefore, the situation there is difficult. That is already obvious. And no matter how Russia tries to present it differently, it is very serious and will only get worse.
Yuri, let's pretend that we believe the Gauleiters, Razvozhayev, Aksionov, and the other so-called leaders in quotation marks, that the legal regime of a state of emergency will help calm the panic and normalize the functioning of all vital sectors. As Aksionov says, he puts it very nicely, really wraps it up. Well, how realistic is that? To what extent do Crimea's own reserves allow for this? Yes, to calm the panic and provide everything necessary for the residents, the occupation contingent, and so on.
No, I'm not actually talking about Crimea. That is maybe not some kind of tragic West. It's important to understand that the lifestyle Russians lead in Crimea, that is the maintenance of that huge contingent, that army currently stationed on Ukrainian territory, including Crimea itself, the occupied part of Kherson region and Zaporizhia region. All of this depends on Crimea. These are pieces of occupied territory. This is all supplied through Crimea. No, there's absolutely no possibility there. Fuel can only be brought in from the outside via the Crimean bridge, as of today. I understand that the Russians will take the risk to do this. Some fuel will make its way into Crimea, but it will clearly not be enough to ensure normal life. Maybe they'll try to create some kind of separate picture. What we know right now is that Crimea lacks even... There is no fuel supply. In other words, Crimea does not have enough fuel and reserves to supply electricity to the peninsula. I think the situation will not improve in the near future, or Russia would have to really mobilize all the forces and resources it has in order to supply Crimea specifically. Well, in my opinion, that would be an even bigger mistake. Instead of basically focusing on ending the war, negotiating, realizing that the situation will not fundamentally change, Putin will definitely continue to spend all possible resources and efforts to create the image he wants in Crimea. And here I can only sympathize with the people of Crimea. I recommend that pro-Ukrainian Crimeans be patient. I think that now, quite reasonably so, the issue of Crimea's deoccupation is already within a reasonable historical perspective. So if we're lucky, and if Putin shows the necessary level of persistence, because let me remind you, Putin himself still has on his desk President Zelensky's proposal to end the war, for now through a ceasefire and later to return to resolving territorial issues by peaceful means. But knowing Vladimir Putin, knowing how inadequate he is in assessing his own strength, I am sure that, unfortunately, he will not stop the war right now. But on the other hand, fortunately, in any case, he will lead Russia to defeat, simply because he cannot behave any other way.
Regarding Putin's regime, what can be predicted here, so to speak, is at what stage it is now. At first, there was more denial, but perhaps now somewhere there is acceptance. As for reaching an agreement, let's see how the decision unfolds. Here the Hill writes that Putin's regime may not survive the firepower and logistical collapse of temporarily occupied Crimea. American experts on national security and military intelligence are writing about this. Mark Todd and retired Colonel Jonathan Sweet wrote about it in a column for The Hill. They say that Moscow is spending up to 50% of the state budget on military needs, losing more every month, plus another 35,000 soldiers, which undermines the stability of the state. And the experts also fully agree with the position of the former commander of the US Army in Europe, General Ben Hodges, who calls Crimea the decisive battleground in this war. He emphasizes that for a strategic victory, Ukraine doesn't even need to immediately reclaim the peninsula, physically. It is enough to make it unusable for further military use by Russia, and this process will be completed by the final destruction of the $4 billion Kerch Bridge. How much do you agree with these opinions? How do you assess the development of events?
Well, let's put it this way. I think that's very close to the truth because, well, as for the end of the regime, I don't really know. It seems to me that right now, this is too much of our wishful thinking. We want it to be that way, of course. But we have to understand that things won't always turn out the way we want. That is, well, this is, of course, a very serious blow to prestige. I believe that nothing can compare in terms of harm to Vladimir Putin with the potential loss of Crimea. And even the potential to lose Crimea, that is, to lose it physically, but every moment that makes Crimea unusable deals a heavy blow to Putin and seriously damages his authority. That's the plain truth, on the one hand. On the other hand, what we need to understand for ourselves is this. Now, yes, the approach we're used to on our side, we need to make the most of it in this matter. And even if, for example, Crimea doesn't collapse, the destruction of the Kerch Bridge, if it can be pulled off, plus the isolation of the so-called federal highway Novorossiya, these are the tools that allow Ukraine, at the very least, and this is important, to seriously cut off and weaken the group of troops holding everything in southern Ukraine. Because the supply of these units, which are now holding the Zaporizhia region and partly the Dnipropetrovsk region, partly the Kherson region, and a very small area, in the case of Mykolaiv, the Kinburn Spit, which Russia still holds, also depends on Crimea and the entire so-called land corridor to Crimea. Therefore, if it becomes possible to completely isolate, for example, ideally, the Russian troop grouping in the south and even complicate their evacuation if necessary, I think Russia could suffer a very serious blow to both their ability to wage war and to their morale. It seems to me that this, of course, would be one of the decisive blows in this war, but we need to wait for the moment when this is accomplished, because as of today, we need to understand what comes next. The destruction of the Kerch Bridge is still unresolved, and it will still be quite a difficult task. So let's wait for the result. I think it will happen. The armed forces of Ukraine are demonstrating remarkable creativity in these matters. Russia will not, in this case, cover the Turpin Bridge with civilians, but we can definitely expect that Ukraine will try to isolate it and make Crimea unsuitable for military and political use.
Let's look at the situation with Crimea from the perspective of election campaigning. Or maybe not campaigning, I don't know. Off the top of my head, I can't think of an antonym for that word, regarding the upcoming State Duma elections in September. What do the propagandists say about this, and how, after the end, well, at least after that 40-day operation announced by President Zelensky, will the Russians themselves view the situation?
I think the question is, what goal are we trying to achieve? Because if we're talking about this somehow influencing the elections, then of course not. They'll just fabricate whatever results they need anyway. Plus, the parties that are still anti-opposition, meaning controlled by the Kremlin and playing the role of a so-called opposition, they are still silent about the war. Of course, they talk about some inconveniences, but they focus on other kinds of inconveniences. They talk about internet blockages. But the biggest Russian problem, of course, compared to Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries and on the occupied regions. No, of course, all of this, for me, the main thing is internet blocking on the one hand. On the other hand, you have to understand that when we attack Crimea, when we, in general, attack and bleed the Russian regime dry, our primary goal is not to make Russians rebel against Putin, but to make them stop believing in Putin. So that Vladimir Putin stops being a sacred, untouchable cow for them, and the regime stops appearing effective. This is a solvable task, which obviously the Ukrainian army is accomplishing. So the faith in Vladimir Putin, the faith in his regime, the belief that he is capable of solving the problems he himself creates and sets will become obvious. We will actually see a completely different level, including the willingness to fight for this regime. That's true. So we need to understand that this Putin regime at this point is sustained almost exclusively by the fact that there is a large group of people who believe in his power, in the fact that he remains effective enough in terms of maintaining his own authority. And as soon as this faith is undermined, we will see a completely different level of perception of power. And such regimes, they begin to crumble when the faith in them is exhausted. Right now, this threshold is quite close, in my opinion. I believe that the Russian regime is currently at its most vulnerable point, and there are no longer any significant forces left in Russia who would consider Vladimir Putin an effective ruler or a great leader. There are practically no such forces left in Russia anymore. This, in essence, is our goal: the complete undermining of the legitimacy of Putin's rule. If this is achieved, I assure you, in the very near future, we will see real peace, and essentially we will enter into negotiations. The difference is these negotiations will no longer be with Putin.
It's interesting how long they'll stick to the rhetoric that there's no gasoline shortage, when in fact there's only a negative increase in its supply at gas stations. And all this is happening against the backdrop of Ukrainian drone strikes turning temporarily occupied Crimea into a full-fledged combat zone, where it is becoming increasingly difficult for Russia to maintain the appearance of normal life. The Economist writes about this, noting that such attacks occur regularly. Military facilities, railway infrastructure, power stations, and logistics hubs are coming under attack. And also, the publication emphasizes that residents of the peninsula are facing power outages, fuel shortages, and a growing sense of insecurity. And many who have the opportunity are moving their families and buying property in Russia. At the same time, the authors note that the war is causing increasing fatigue both in Crimea and in Russia itself, where among the elite there is a growing the realization that the situation is reaching a strategic dead end. How would you assess how long the Russian government can keep up this verbal juggling act and this convenient disregard for what is happening in Crimea? The Russians themselves, who meet Crimeans on their, let's say, mainland territory, are furious that they fill up at their gas stations, and in general it almost comes to knife fights. Like they've all come here and there's not enough for us as it is. But what is actually happening in Crimea itself? It's kept quiet, not mentioned in the news, avoided.
It seems to me that this is already, a way to keep an open secret, because Russian propaganda is super centralized and super secretive. A parallel reality exists in Russia. If a person really tries not to ignore things and stay out of politics, we've heard from many such Russians, and I repeat, you can genuinely see that people are sincerely surprised by what's happening because they truly did everything possible to shield themselves from the political context and not notice what's actually going on in the world. But overall, people there, let's be objective, are not living in some kind of information vacuum. Most of them understand everything perfectly well. They fully understand what they've been doing all these years. They clearly understand the reasons why things are happening the way they are. They just try not to express this socially. They are fully aware that there is a war going on. They clearly understand that everything is happening because of the strikes on Ukraine, which have finally received a worthy response of retribution. And it seems to me that overall, the fact that they are angry at the people of Crimea, well, that's just how it is. Nothing can be done about it. And that's actually good, because years of lies and propaganda will come to an end. Hatred, and in our case, let's be objective, the awakened hatred that Vladimir Putin himself so heroically stirred up plays a very positive role for us for Ukraine. If the number of internal conflicts in Russia increases, if the number of internal confrontations grows, if the level of tension between, let's say, between locals and newcomers, between various groups of Russians themselves, when, for example, Muscovites start fighting with people from Ryazan over fuel, that suits us perfectly. The more tension there is, the more mutual hatred, the better it is for us, because it weakens the regime and continues to provoke conflicts within Russian society. For me, there are absolutely no downsides here. Of course, I would really like, it's true, for this war to end in some, not necessarily in a more civilized way, but just to end without massacres on Ukraine's borders, because it's important to understand that Ukraine does not benefit from a civil war in Russia, except in the context of a large-scale civil confrontation in Russia, and only if it leads to a quick end to the war, because here too a fact is a fact. Russia is our big neighbor. Many Russians, one way or another, will, let's put it this way, try to run away, either to Europe or to Ukraine, to escape such a confrontation. This will also become part of our problem, our agenda, and there's nothing we can do about it. But globally, of course, I can only welcome everything that Vladimir Putin is doing. He is doing everything to ensure that Russia ends up in a civil war. And basically, they will finally leave us alone and start dealing with their own problems.
That's for sure.
It-
If they finished all this as soon as possible, wrapped up their so-called special military operation, and focused on domestic issues like where to get gasoline and everything else. Thank you, Yuri. Yuri Bogdanov, strategic communications consultant and publicist, was with us on the line.